To do a brief introduction. So my name's Eva. I'm from the partnerships team. And I used to be a science teacher, so this is definitely not my area of expertise. So I'm going to hand swiftly over to my colleague Michelin, who's our head of English.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining this afternoon. If you're here, hopefully it's because you want to know a little bit more about how we have built our sentence level mastery and also thinking about how we can use that document and kind of progression map to really support with year 6 and year 7 transition, because we know that's something that schools are really focusing on at the moment, and we really want to support as many schools as possible. So my name is Michelin, I'm the head of English Secondary, and I lead the team in terms of our curriculum design and also support all of the ARC schools within the ARC network. So just a quick agenda. I'm just going to give you a little background in terms of who we are, and then just go through the steps in terms of why should we teach syntax? Why is it such an important thing to focus on in English, especially with writing progression? Thinking about how it might affect leadership, like why is it a leadership issue? And then sharing some strategies in terms of what we've done within ARC and how you might want to use the document that Eva's already shared, but also if you join the program, thinking about what that looks like in terms of Key Stage 3 sentence level progression as well. So just a really, really quick background, because you might be thinking, well, who is Michelin and what does she know about writing progression, and why ARC Curriculum Plus involved? So our programme has grown out of ARC, which is one of the highest performing multi-academy trusts in the UK. We have 39 schools in Birmingham, London, Hastings and Portsmouth. We launched in art schools in 2014, and since then our programme has been used outside of art schools, and actually our programmes, maths, English and science, are now used in around 600 schools and 15 multi-academy trusts. So 10 years ago we were just within ARC, and now we're really proud that we're used across the country in terms of curriculum and also just the full programme. Now, really, our main mission is this, to empower teachers, to give every young person, regardless of their background, the subject knowledge and skills that allow them to succeed. So children and young people are at the centre of what we do. And ultimately, we want children to enjoy English. Like, we think that the discipline of English is so important, and we want students to have a really good provision in terms of high quality English teaching within schools. So where we can support teachers in delivering that to students, that's where our mission lies. And our curriculum is heavily influenced by cognitive science research, particularly in terms of how it can be applied in the classroom to drive student progress and attainment. So that's who we are. We've tested our curriculum within schools. We use the ARC network to kind of help inform our design of the curriculum, and then we share that with our schools nationwide. So just a really quick activity. I have taken some news quotes that hail from, so one is from 50 years ago, one is from 20 years ago, and one is from 5 years ago. So just in the chat, I'm just going to ask you to see can you tell which one is which? So one's from 50 years, 20 years, and 5. So I'll just give you a minute just to put your guesses in and tell me what you think. Give you a minute to read those, and then just, really quick thoughts. Which is the oldest news quote? Thank you, Sarah, for being first to put yours in. See the oldest. Okay. Right. Okay. Let's reveal them. So we have A is from is most recent from Sydney Herald in 2020 in Australia. Passage B appeared 23 years ago in 2002 from the Telegraph, and C is from 1975 Newsweek. Now, the quotes. Why have I done that? Well, the quotes paint a damning picture, and actually quite a contradictory one. So students are capable, but they're not able to write. And that's quite interesting, especially as, some of these students who come from prestigious establishments, if we look at number C, for example, we'd expect them to be able to write proficiently. But actually, even the more articulate and sophisticated students are still not able, perhaps, to write. And so we've got to ask ourselves, why is it that this is still the issue now? 50 years ago, there was an article about Johnny can't write. Why is it today we're still having issues of Johnny writing and other students not being able to write? So it really is an important issue. Now, we know writing is difficult. In fact, in the recent DfE Writing Framework, the DfE says that writing is the most cognitively demanding task that we have to ask our pupils to master at school. Now, it's great to see that in the National Year of Reading, it's really heartening to see that reading outcomes have largely recovered from post-pandemic. So this is from the Curriculum and Assessment Review. But sadly, our work is not done. So if you're an English or literacy teacher or just a teacher in general, we can see that actually writing has still not recovered, that writing progression still is not as strong as reading. And it's great that we're putting steps in to improve reading. Your school's probably got a really great reading strategy, but now we also need to start thinking about, well, what's our writing strategy? How can we help our writing recover? So before we share our sentence mastery sequence and some of the steps that we've put together in ARC to kind of address that, I just want you to think about, what does make writing feel difficult? If we know it's a cognitive demanding task, but what is it that makes it overwhelming for some of our pupils? And why perhaps do some people struggle to express their ideas clearly? So I'll just give you a minute just to share some of your ideas in the chat feed. Thank you, Louise. Yeah, I think that's a really important point that actually sometimes for creative writing, especially, students don't have necessarily those experiences to draw from. So sometimes it's having the knowledge to be able to imagine being in a certain situation. Yes, definitely. And that links me really nicely onto my next point of the cognitive functions that's required for writing. Yeah, Sarah, thank you. Summative skills, so many different elements. Agree, cognitive and functional. Yes, there's lots and lots of different steps for writing, isn't there? Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. But yes, exactly what a lot of you are already saying, that writing is really, really hard. We already know the DfE says it's probably the most challenging skills for pupils to master. Kellogg actually mentioned it as the cognitive equivalent of digging ditches. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't want to be digging a ditch, especially with my old back. But the reality is that many pupils hit the limits of working memory before they've even begun to craft an argument or tell us a story. So the research tells us that it's twice as cognitive demanding as reading. And why is that? Because there's so many components that's needed for writing. So I'm just going to quickly talk you through just some of the things cognitively that students have to think of and hold in their minds at the same time when they're writing. So if we're thinking at a micro level, some of the things that they have to think about, well, actually, students need to select the most appropriate vocabulary from a sufficiently broad lexicon. And then they've got to think about transcribing it, their letter formation. So not only are they thinking about the words that they might want to use, they're then perhaps thinking about letter formation. Those who perhaps haven't secured that at Key Stage 2, that's going to be something that's going to be quite demanding for them. And then they're going to be thinking about, oh, have I spelt this correctly? Especially, those students perhaps who might have a specific need in that, that perhaps is perhaps at the forefront of their mind. And that's probably the one thing that they're really focusing on. And as well as that, they're then thinking about how to structure their syntax. What are the grammatical rules? How does this sentence make sense? And then they're thinking about grammar and punctuation. Now, it's quite interesting because sometimes perhaps we obsess with the proofreading and focus a lot on the grammar and punctuation. But actually, there's all of these things happening perhaps even before they start thinking about the grammar and punctuation. And then on a wider level, in terms of text level, students are then thinking about, okay, what text type is this? Okay, what is the genre of writing that I've got to follow? And what are the particular features or tropes of that particular genre that I need to make sure that I include in my writing? Another thing they've got to think about is their audience. What's the purpose of this writing? Who am I writing for? How is my language going to change if I'm writing for a specific audience? Does it need to be formal? Does it need to be informal? And then they've got to think about, somebody mentioned earlier about the information. Have they got the right information to write about it clearly? Do they need to read a little bit more to be able to write about that particular topic in a more detailed way? And then they've got to think about, okay, how do I develop and organize my ideas? When do I put in paragraphs? What should be my introduction? What should be my conclusion? So as well as thinking about all of the information they've got to think about, they've then got to think about, is this organized in the right way? Does it make sense? Does it flow? Is my writing actually cohesive? Does it make sense? And so you can see that actually there's a lot happening there. So if we're thinking at micro level, sometimes perhaps we focus too much on the micro, but we're also thinking about the macro as well. And I think sometimes vice versa, perhaps sometimes we focus on too much, all of those things at one time, and sometimes perhaps we focus on one thing too much over another. So what is the answer? If writing is really hard, what is the missing ingredient? Well, we did lots of reading, lots of research, lots of collaboration. And within ARC, we think that actually it is sentence structure and sentence fluency that is the game changer. So we think that students need a toolkit in order to manipulate language, because once students understand the rules of syntax, understand the rules of language, then they can manipulate that later on for precision, emphasis, and effect. That's essentially what the English language is. If we're thinking about, language in politics and how language persuades and manipulates the audience, etc., we've got to be able to give students a toolkit to be able to do that, to be able to do it themselves, but also spot it in reading. And so we think that this is what's going to make the difference, that if we automatize the micro processes, then hopefully that will make the macro less cognitively burdensome. And we think that actually where we can make a difference is if we really focus on sentence structure and syntax. So before we even think about how do we teach the syntax, what sentence structure should we focus on? One of the things that we did within one of our first steps was thinking about, well, actually, we can't teach sentences unless we actually know what they really are. Now, within ARC, we do a subject review, and in 2024, we wanted to just kind of do a little bit of research in terms of what's a shared language as educators. So within ARC, our English teams conducted a primary and secondary English subject review across our network of schools. And we asked them, how do we define a sentence? Now, in the primary subject review, actually, the findings was that across most schools, Key Stage 2 pupils weren't able to say what made a sentence. And actually, what was even more interesting was that teachers within the same school weren't always aligned in terms of the explanations that they gave either. So, just a little task for you before I share some of our findings. I would like you to put in the chat, we'll see how different they are. How would you define a sentence? And if you've got some time, you might want to write down, what do you think your students would say if you asked them that same question? So I'll just give you a couple of minutes just to pick your thoughts. Yeah, that was a common one, Louise, focusing on, it starts with a capital letter and ends with a full stop. Yeah, that's definitely probably the most general one that or popular one that we get. Yeah, mention of clause. Brilliant. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, containing a verb, complete unit of meaning. Yeah. So yeah, so you can see even just within this chat, there's lots of different definitions, and it's something definitely that we saw within the network as well. So I'll just show you now that these were some of the definitions that we got from teachers, and also from actual other sources, external sources. So you'll see there we got one from the National Curriculum, there's one from the Writing Revolution. So we've looked at lots of definitions of sentences from various sources, and you can see here they're so different. And it can be quite difficult, therefore, to think about, okay, well, how do we really define it? Which definition do we really want to focus on as a trust or as a school that we think is really important? So I'll just give you one more minute just to kind of look at some of those external sources. And then what I'll also share with you is, which I think is quite sweet and fun, is our pupil answers to what's a sentence. We had some were very honest, not sure. Like, how old are you? So yeah, so here are some answers from art pupils from that curriculum review. Yeah. So it's just to highlight that actually, even just starting from the very beginning of what is a sentence can be already challenging. For me, when thinking about the power of a sentence, I always return to this Doug Lemov quote. And it's quite long there. I'll give you a moment to read it. But for me, it's just that idea of we want to intentionally teach students how to unlock the mystery of a sentence in order to master it. And so it's really important that we really think about teaching, teaching sentence level to an intentional level for students so that we can help them manipulate those sentences and create their own to manipulate for effect and meaning. So what's been done so far in terms of writing progression? How do we, where do we start? What's already the existing documentation out there that can support schools in terms of writing? So the government is committed to ensuring strong foundations in reading and writing for all children. And the DfE Writing Framework, which was released in July 2025, is a step towards this. So it gives us a few ideas as to why Johnny, for example, at the beginning of the webinar, still can't write. And it's a framework that outlines a common approach to teaching writing, which is rooted in evidence and also existing practice, which I think is really important because it shines a much needed spotlight on sentence mastery as a cornerstone of writing success. However, what the writing framework didn't tell us is what should be taught and also when. So we recognize that actually within ARC, that is a really, really big document. The reality is that teachers are really, really busy, leaders are really, really busy. And so they're not necessarily going to have time to go through that writing framework, but also it requires a lot of thinking time to think about, okay, what should be taught and when should it be taught? And so that's something that was really important to us within ARC. We realized actually we need to create something else to really support our teachers to think about the next steps and how to use this framework. Now, the ARC sentence mastery sequence has taken years of research and also collaboration. We were lucky to use the expertise across the ARC network because we have ARC Start, which is our early years provision. We have English Mastery Primary curriculum, and we also have the English Mastery Key Stage 3 curriculum. So we joined forces, we used the expertise within all of those organizations within ARC, and it's given us the opportunity to identify what knowledge is foundational, that is really important to be taught in early years, but then also what knowledge needs building upon in Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3, and which of those is a real prerequisite for GCSE. So from our work across ARC schools, we really aimed to solve 3 challenges that we were seeing in the network. Number one, leaders wanted a clear sequence that clarified what should be taught and also what order. Number two, teachers actually just wanted some manageable steps. So they don't just want a big overview document. They also want steps of, okay, here's the first step that you should follow, second step, and precise examples of what that might look like in the classroom, and real clarity in terms of progression. So what are we expecting in terms of outcomes for a year 7 student? What does that look like at the end of the year 9? How does that knowledge build upon each other. And then more importantly, especially for those who are thinking about transition and year 7 students, what we're finding was that there were lots of students perhaps who were able to write, analytical sentences, but actually still weren't closing the gaps. Perhaps they're able to follow a scaffold or a writing model, but actually when you dug deeper, you could still see that there were still gaps from Key Stage 2. So we wanted to know, how can we make sure that we're trying to do as much as possible to close some of those gaps. Now, earlier we talked about, okay, what does a sentence look like? And you'll see in our sequence that Eva shared the link to earlier, one of the first things we wanted to do as a team was think about, what is a sentence? How do you define a sentence in early years, and how does that definition perhaps evolve across early years to Key Stage 3? Because we know that there's more knowledge taught additionally, every year. So we wanted to think about, okay, well, in early years, what does it look like? But how does that progress, and what's that going to look like by year 7? So that we can have an understanding of, because sometimes I think we get year 7 students and we just assume that they're a blank slate, and we kind of completely forget what came at Key Stage 2. So here we're trying to show you, actually, this is what they should have been taught in this particular year group, and this is what they should come to you as, and that's where you should be picking up. However, if not, that's where we can start closing the gaps. So I just wanted to share, one of the things that we understood that we needed to define sentences. We knew the steps that we wanted to kind of support leaders and teachers, but then we wanted to see, well, what are we seeing in terms of in the network when we're doing our school visits, when we're going to deliver training in schools, etc. What are we actually seeing? Now, a particular highlight for me when I visit the art network and the art schools is just listening to students explain their ideas out loud. I feel like they're always like curious and fizzing to say as much as possible orally, but when you ask them to then express those thoughts in writing, some of them tend to hesitate. So they pop up and say, well, I really know what I want to say, but I can't perhaps put it into writing. So turning speech into sentences can be harder for some students. And for school leaders, this becomes a bigger challenge, because the move from talk to text is precisely where students hesitate. And without a clear sort of shared route into sentences, that gap will only become bigger. And one of the other things I find is that, it's not effort. Teachers really work hard to improve writing, but sometimes the curriculum perhaps skips the foundations. So when I see some lessons, for example, sometimes there's lots of year 7 students who can annotate a text, or, they can really pick apart a quotation, do lots of quote explosions, for example, but they can't actually write a precise topic sentence. So perhaps they've kind of skipped a step. They know how to annotate, but then how do they turn those ideas into a clear topic sentence? And then there's that reliance on writing scaffolds as well, that actually when we're asking them to write a clear argument, sometimes instead of thinking about the actual opinion or the argument they want to argue, they're actually just thinking about following a writing structure such as Peel, and I'll talk about scaffolds in a moment. So again, like we spoke about earlier in terms of cognitive demand, there's all these other things that they're struggling with as well. So what we're seeing in the network, well, we have our good old, hopefully we don't see, unfortunately, I do still see many of these scaffolds, but a forest is still prominent in schools, and Peel is still a kind of a regular kind of appearance in schools as well. And it's not just Peel. I've collected a very long list of writing scaffolds, and this is just within one network. If you go to other schools in other multi-academy trusts, there'll be other structures as well. But you'll see that actually writing scaffold has many mutations. From P, you've got Peel, P, etc., and many more. And you might be thinking, well, as a leader, well, why is this an issue? It doesn't matter if they follow writing scaffolds. Well, actually, if you think about it, if one class learns to write strong topic sentences, and then another one focuses on just following P or Peel or PZ, Whereas in history or geography, so in another subject, students might be taught to follow what, how, why. So actually in one school alone, the various ways of teaching sentences and paragraphs could be endless. And that's going to exacerbate the cognitive load for pupils again, because, moving from English to history to geography, they might have 3 or 4 different scaffolds that they're following. And so it's thinking about, okay, whole school, is there a particular way in terms of how we teach writing? So it's not just for English teachers to think about, but it's also think about how is actual, extended writing taught across subjects as well. And are we helping students in terms of reducing that cognitive load, just in terms of the scaffolds that they follow? And also, I think the disappointing thing is if we see some students in year 11 still using the scaffolds perhaps they learned in year 6 or year 7, because then we've got to think about where is the progression there, and why are those scaffolds not kind of, a scaffold is meant to be temporary, why are those scaffolds still there? And that leads me on to my next point of, there's a really great book called The Scaffolding Effect. It's written by Ball and Fairlam. But they mention that scaffolds are not meant to be permanent. If everyone has a scaffold all of the time, actually it's not a scaffold, it's just a lesson plan. And that's really true. When I speak to students, sometimes I ask them, what are you doing in your writing? What have you got to be able to show in your writing, in your essay? A lot of the time students might say, I've got to make sure I follow a PEAL or a PZ paragraph. So they're just thinking about following the scaffold rather than thinking about the intention of the writing and the effect of the writing. And we know that this is an issue. In the GCSE examiner reports, recently they still mentioned that actually it's those scaffolded paragraphs that actually become quite restrictive. So the higher end students tend to not follow those scaffolds, and those who do kind of in a way get restricted by it. So we've got to think about, how do we support that as well? How do we help remove some of those scaffolds for our students? So before I go through some of exactly what we teach in year 7 to year 9 in terms of sentence level progression, I'm just going to, quick question again, just 1 minute in the chat. Do you use paragraph scaffolds? What ones do you use? Why or why not? How does that vary in Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4? So I'll just give you a minute to think about that. How do you teach analytical writing currently? Yes, good old Peter is there. Great, thank you. Yes, there's lots of what, how, why, and I think that is a great one. I think it's just think about, if we're going to use a scaffold, how does that look different in year 11 to year 7? Is it still exactly the same way that we teach it? So Victoria has kindly put in there, yes, it's slightly different. So in year 7, year 8 is those additional steps are added. Thank you. Okay, so in terms of our sentence scaffold, we first of all we didn't just collaborate with an ARC. We went to other thinkers in writing. So we looked at cognitive load theory with Sweller. We looked at Hockman and Wexler's writing revolution as well. We looked at Daisy Christodoulou's work in no more marking and writing, the DfE framework, and we also David Dodau consulted in some of the stuff as well that we put together. So we made sure that we did use external sources and what the current thinking and writing is already. Now, for our sentence sequence, we identified that actually it can be tricky sometimes, because we have when students come in year 7, there are going to be students who have met expected and not expected. And so in terms of our writing, so our writing is split into 2. We've got writing in terms of creative writing, but we've also got writing in terms of analytical writing. Now, there are 2 sets of objectives for year 7. So so you'll see that WTS is working towards expected standard. That means that students would be doing what we call Writing Mastery 1, which is our first unit in Writing Mastery. And then for those who've met expected, then they would be using Writing Mastery 2. Now, the sequence that we have put together, so the sequence that you will have that Eva put in the chat is early years up to year 7. What I'm going to show you now is just the progression from year 7 to year 9. So how we've set that out. So I've just kind of put them side by side. So the sequence really is meant to be a diagnostic tool. So schools can begin year 7 by identifying which micro skills students bring from Key Stage 2 and also where those gaps remain. So that helps teachers meet pupils where they are and address gaps in foundational knowledge. Now, if we look at the Key Stage 3 sequence itself, it's quite straightforward. So you'll see in year 7, pupils learn to write topic sentences and embed evidence neatly and add details using simple structures like because, but, so. They then build comparative and alternative ideas for more nuanced responses. And then by year 8, they apply these two skills to introductions, conclusions, thesis statements. And then in year 9, they're really thinking about writing thesis statements to embed contextual knowledge. So you can see kind of the progression there. Because what we were seeing in schools was when we were asking them, okay, well, how are students' topic sentences in year 9 meant to be different from what they're writing in year 7? And often teachers couldn't really articulate that. And so what we wanted to show was a real progression of, well, this is what they're taught at Key Stage 2. Here is what a typical student who's working expected. This is what we would expect them to be able to do by the end of that year. Now, this is just for analytical and essay writing, so I haven't included here the sentence level objectives for creative writing. But you can see here, just in essay writing, we've kind of tracked, okay, well, this is where we teach this in this unit. We explicitly teach because, but, so in this particular unit, and then this is how it progresses. So we wanted to show that clear progression for teachers and leaders. And then what we've done is we've broken, each objective is then broken down further to support students, teachers and students. So what we're doing is providing manageable steps. So we've got the sentence level objectives. We then think about, okay, what does a teacher need to know to teach this? How can we break that objective down? What are students meant to take away from this? What's the key vocabulary? And what are some of the MCQs or low stakes questions that you might want to ask in a do now or homework, etc.? And what does that look like? So we give you precise examples. So if we take the example of writing clear topic sentences, for example, to introduce analysis in year 7, based on our knowledge of Key Stage 2, we know that this objective requires recapping foundational knowledge that's actually taught in year 4 and year 5. So you can see here the prerequisites are actually in year 4, they're taught how to identify and write topic sentences and how to start a new paragraph. In year 5, they're taught how to identify and write an introductory paragraph and expositional writing. So we know that that foundational knowledge, because we've spoken to our primary team, our early years team, we know that should actually be taught already at Key Stage 2. So ideally, if a student's working expected, they should remember that from year 4 and year 5, a topic sentence acts like a mini introduction and summarizes the main idea in a paragraph. Therefore, we can already build on that knowledge to explore why they're essential when writing an essay. So we can move on and follow kind of that new learning. So, okay, we're kind of saying to you, well, this is what they were taught. Is that true? Can you do a quick check? If so, okay, they're ready to write clear topic sentences. Let's now go through those steps. However, you might find a class, actually, the majority of them haven't secured what they were taught in year 4 or year 5. And therefore, that's why it's really useful for you to have the Key Stage 2 and early years progression map, because what you can then do is just meet students where they are. So there's no point teaching them about topic sentences if they haven't really secured what they were meant to know at year 4 and year 5. So therefore, you can go back to the year 4 sentence level objectives, look at those, and think, okay, what are some of the things that I could probably use to test their knowledge, or what's most important for me to reteach before I even start thinking about topic sentences. So that way we're teaching them to walk before they run, and we can go back and close those gaps before we even start looking at, the expected objectives for that particular sentence level. So I'm going to give you a moment just to look at some of the things that we think are really important in terms of analytical writing and essay writing, and just think about, do you already teach some of these things? Are there things here that you explicitly don't teach? And just think why. So just give you a moment now just to kind of look over those and think about, is there anything there that you already cover and teach? If you want to, in that link that Eva's put in the chat, the full year 7 sequence is there, so you can have a look at how each of these are broken down further if you'd like. But just give you a sense of how that might look like in your classroom. Okay, and you might just want to share in the chat if there's any that you don't explicitly teach. You could just put a number, it doesn't have to be the full thing. So it could be 7.9, for example, 7.10. Is there anything that you don't currently explicitly teach to students? Thank you, Sarah. So yes, so writing an analytical sentence that begins with a prepositional phrase to explore structure. Great. Yeah, so I think one of the things to think about, these are things we would expect them to be able to do by the end of year 7. And so what we've now then done is we've then looked at the units that we teach in year 7, and we've tried to make sure that within those units, we do provide resources that explicitly teach those things. So for example, the 7.8 is a popular one. We start looking at structure when we're looking at Midsummer Night's Dream, because we look at the love potion and how that affects the characters, but also how that affects the structure of the play. So that's where we would start teaching that explicitly, and that's in the spring term. So I think what's great is, I think Writing Revolution has done so much in terms of sentence level and teaching of syntax, but sometimes I think it can be tricky to think about how does that slot within your actual curriculum. And so one of the things we wanted to do was just, and I'll show you some examples in a moment, was just to think about, okay, where are we explicitly teaching these? Do teachers know in which particular units? And also as a team, like, is it really clear for teachers to understand when these things are taught? Because sometimes, we might expect students to write an essay, and we're expecting all of these things to be in their autumn 2 end of unit assessment, for example, and that shouldn't be the case. So we wanted to make it really clear, well, this is what we would expect at the end of year 7. And actually, for some of your year 7s, it might not be all of these. It might actually be some of year 6 as well, because you're still closing some of those gaps. So the whole point of this is not to be prescriptive. It's just to think about, okay, this is what is the expectation is, but actually because we've tracked it back to Key Stage 2, we can go take a step back and think about, okay, where can we start closing those gaps first? So one of the things that so I'll just show you some examples. So I think one of the things, and the scaffolds that you use, like Peter and what, how, why, might be working really well in your school. And it's not to say that we need to get rid of those, but it is thinking about how can we slowly start to take those scaffolds away? Can we be really confident that students are able to do that particular sentence level really, like, independently, and have they really mastered it? So I'll just show you an example. So when we're thinking about taking away scaffolds for year 7, we've got to really ask ourselves these questions. Like, first of all, can students make a really clear point? Do their point actually make sense? But can they write a clear point that steers their argument, not just restating the question? Because often we've taught students just reword the question, but actually, can they come up with their own valid, independent argument? And maybe that's going to, and we're saying that doesn't just come through writing. There's going to be lots of oral rehearsal, for example, lots of discussion that's going to help facilitate that in terms of sharing their argument before perhaps they put it into writing. Does their point show independent thought or a clear stance? Because if they're able to do all of those things, then perhaps actually it's time to remove some of those scaffolds. And if not, then that's where some of our resources come in. So I'm just going to show you some examples from some of our Year 7 lessons, but it's just kind of to hopefully this will kind of prompt you to think about, how do we teach a topic sentence? Is it taught in a consistent way across a department? Is it taught consistently across a year group? So some of these things that I'll show you hopefully will kind of prompt that discussion with your own teams, thinking about how consistent is our approach. So in Year 7, we teach them, one of the key first things that we teach them in Oliver Twist is that actually a topic sentence has to do three important things: that it answers the questions, it says something accurate, and it focuses on one thing. And within our lessons, we explicitly try to practice that. So you'll see here an example of Noah Claypole. We're saying that actually Dickens presents Noah Claypole as cruel, and we've got to, perhaps looking at the evidence all together, perhaps unpicking a quote together, but we're making sure, even before we carry on with the rest of the paragraph, that actually the topic sentence that they've written is answering that criteria or meeting that criteria before we move on. And then we move on to the next bit. So, these are just some examples of how, you might do a quote explosion, etc. But it's thinking about how is he shown as cruel? Let's look at our quotations in a lot of detail. And obviously this might look familiar, but you might color code in terms of, what does that look like in a paragraph? So within our sentence level progression, where we've got, so I'm just going to go back a couple of slides so that you can see in Year 7, 8, and 9, but you'll see here where we've got the three different across year groups within our different units. We will have introduced an explicit skill in those units, and we've tried to make it really clear in our unit intent, in our curriculum map. We'll introduce, this is the sentence level progression that we're really focusing on in analytical writing for this year group. So we don't expect schools to follow this exactly, but it's asking departments to think about what is their approach. If it's not this, what is their approach? Do they have a document, or are you able to really articulate? Is every single teacher in your team able to articulate how writing progresses from Year 7, Year 9, and not just with using scaffolds, not just using what, how, why? How does what, how, why, for example, if that's the scaffold you want to use, how is that different in year 9? And how is that different in Year 7? Like, what are you teaching in between to show that progression in writing? So I'm just gonna, skip ahead a little bit. There we go. Right, so my key message is actually application is the key. Sometimes sentence construction can be planned to be taught as an explicit strategy. So for example, a key lesson might be, right, today we're really going to be focusing on embedding quotations, but teachers need to be confident enough to, in each of these things, to be able to spot when and how students' work could benefit from applying them. So just because you've got a lesson planned, it's thinking about, are they ready for this? Or could I use a visualizer to really model this in detail for them? We're going to do a bit of writing, but actually what I really need to show some explicit modeling of what that looks like before, instead of just giving them a scaffold and say, here's one we did earlier, off you go. So it's thinking about, how do we model those processes? How do we make that really explicit? And are we as teachers really confident in breaking down those steps? If not, then perhaps that's where the sentence mastery sequence might be useful in terms of how to break down those steps, in terms of thinking about the different MCQs that you could ask to make sure that students have really secured that learning before moving on to the next bit. So my top tips are, if you're going to look at this document, it's a really long document. I wouldn't suggest just printing it off and giving it to every teacher. I would think about, first of all, which of these things are we already doing? Do we already have a progression within our school? What does that progression actually look like? Think about how you would use that guidance in your classroom. You should allow enough time to revisit these things often. And also just remember, this document that we shared with you just focuses on sentence construction. We're not saying this is what English should all be. This is literally just on sentence construction, and this weaves into how we teach literature and language, etc. So just to kind of take that as face value. Meeting pupils where they are. So using, we've provided Key Stage 2 and early years. So if you have got students coming in at Year 7 and they've not quite met those gaps, meet pupils where they are. If you need to go backwards and take that step backwards, look at what they have taught at Key Stage 2. We want you to use this and change and adapt it that meets your needs as a department, as a school, as a trust. So we're just saying this is how we do it in ARC. Feel free to change and adapt it. You'll need to think about, do we need some specific training and support for our teachers? If this is something that we want to put together and adapt and change for our trust, our school, how are you going to do that? What training are you going to give teachers? What support are you going to give them? What's that going to look like for next academic year, for example? And then think about the transition between key stages. What are you already doing to help close those gaps in writing in year 7? Maybe you've already got some really good strategies in place, but think about how might this fit in with some of those things that you already have in place. So to sum up, I think probably one of the things that would be really useful is, first of all, if you've not done so, I would read the DfE Writing Framework and then look at the sentence mastery sequence, see how they go hand in hand. So the writing framework tells us what should be taught. The sentence mastery sequence is meant to support in terms of what should be taught and when. You might want to audit your current writing provision. So a lot of work I know this year has been really focused on reading and building a reading strategy, especially in the National Year of Reading. But now think about your writing strategy. What are you doing in terms of writing provision? How are you closing those gaps from Key Stage 2 in Year 7? How are you building on foundational knowledge? Do your teachers actually know what foundational knowledge is in writing at Key Stage 2? If not, will this document actually perhaps help you with that? Can you make it clearer to your Year 7 teachers what that foundational knowledge is in writing that they need to secure first? I've seen some really great practice in terms of secondary schools really collaborating with primary colleagues. You might have a particular feeder school. So I would really suggest like visiting those feeder schools. What does it look like in terms of writing? I know when I did it for the first time years ago with my local primary school, I was amazed by the level of writing they do in year 6 in comparison to when they came to us in year 7. So I would definitely already collaborate with primary colleagues. What are they doing? How can you use their knowledge to really support with that transition in year 7? And is there something that you could do collaboratively across those feeder schools to really kind of progress that? We're lucky that we have some schools within ARC that are all phase. So they've got primary and secondary, and those two phases are working together. And that's where the strongest practice is at the moment, because they can see that progression from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3. And then just a final reflection is just thinking about how are you going to use these documents? What kind of change do you want to lead in terms of writing in your department? And how might you use these documents to support you with that? It might be that it could just help you with an audit and you're thinking, actually, we're already doing a lot of this stuff, so this is great. That might just be a kind of positive reinforcement. So it's just thinking about how perhaps you might use this document. Like I said, it's a really big document, so I wouldn't necessarily print it out and just give it to your teachers. Think first, if you're an English lead, how are you going to use that as an English lead to inform your planning? We know that the programs of study are coming out soon. So how might that affect planning for curriculum for 2028, for example? We finished a little bit early today, but I'm going to just pause to see if there's any questions, and feel free to put any questions in the chat now. But I'll stop there and I'll pass on to Eva to see if she's got any other messages.
Fab. Yeah, so I will email everyone here tomorrow, so everyone will have a recording of the webinar to watch back at a convenient time or share with colleagues. I'll also send out tomorrow the link again to the sentence mastery sequence, just so you definitely got it. But then if this webinar has started any kind of thinking about what you might be doing for your sentence structure or English in general for the next year, we're also happy to talk about our specific program if that is something that is of interest to you. So please do pop an email over to partnerships or book in using the link, or respond when I pop you over an email tomorrow. But you'll have those documents so that they are there for you, and the webinar is there for you, the recording as and when needed. We've not got any questions coming through on the chat, but if you do think of something afterwards, for instance, when looking through the sentence mastery sequence, like Michelin says, it is a very long document. If on looking through it in your own time, you find that you have some questions around the ways in which the ARC schools have done it, or want to ask Michelin any questions around it, please do again, just get in touch and we'll be happy to answer them for you.
I am on LinkedIn as well. So if if you want to reach out on LinkedIn, you got a question about the program or how we put this, how we teach writing, etc., please feel free to reach out that way as well. But I've just put so we can see on screen there the email address for partnerships. And yeah, hopefully this has provided you. Thank you, Louise. Yes, I'm glad it's provided with food for thought, just in terms of thinking about your writing progression. So thank you very much for joining us. Hope you have a good rest of the afternoon and evening.
And thank you so much for hosting, Mission. It was very informative.
No worries. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.